Although we tend to focus on those historical figures who get written about the most for obvious reasons, I find the ordinary people of the past to be equally fascinating. Today's guest, Eleanor Barraclough, is throwing light on the lives of ordinary Vikings by telling their stories through the objects they used and the facts we can glean from their bones and material culture. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Hello everybody, welcome to another edition of Future Imperfect with me, Jason Kingsley. I have a wonderful guest and we're going to be talking about Vikings. So Eleanor, would you do us a favour of introducing yourself in any way you like? By song, by interpretive dance?
Oh, I don't know. Song you don't want, interpretive dance, we can pretend it was amazing and no one will ever know differently because it's a podcast. So look, there we go. There's my amazing interpretive dance. I'm Eleanor Barraclough. I am a historian, particularly Vikings, although sort of more broadly, but certainly this book is Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. And that is partly, I think, what we're going to talk about today.
Well, absolutely, yeah. So the name Embers of the Hands, that's quite an interesting title for a book. Do you want to tell us a bit about that before we start talking about Vikings? Because I like that.
Oh, good. I'm pleased you do, because we weren't sure whether it was going to work for a while. But if I explain the context, so it is an authentic Viking kenning. So it's this sort of poetic device. And the Vikings composed insanely complicated poetry, basically like cryptic crosswords. And, you know, they alliterate across the lines and there's all sorts of imagery caught up in this, particularly skaldic verse. And kenning is a type of this poetic device. So something basically you describe something in a roundabout way and people have to unpick it. And Embers of the Hands is one of those. So the initial meaning of Embers of the Hands is gold. It's something that glows and shines in your hands. And it's specifically about being rewarded with gold for a great deed. But I thought, okay, I want to look at the Embers of the Hands that are just as precious, but are less obviously sort of the sort of thing that people at the top of the pile might have owned. So the everyday bits and pieces of everyday lives that just sort of fell between the cracks of history and survive all the way down to the present day. So those are our Embers of the Hands here.
I love that fact about Vikings' language is complex and layered.
Yeah.
Do you think we miss elements of it as well? I mean, whilst we know about kennings, we know the concept. Do you think that because we're culturally not Vikings, there's whole bunches of it that fly past us?
Oh, definitely. I mean, in fact, if you go to the 13th century, so just past the Viking Age proper and Iceland, there's a very important character called Snorri Sturluson. He's a poet, he's a writer, he's a politician, and he writes a handbook we call Snorra Edda. It's one of our main mythological sources for Old Norse pagan religion, but it's also a way of explaining to 13th century poets in Iceland how to use these sorts of very complex poetic devices, because, yeah, even at the time and in the centuries afterwards, it was really hard to remember it all. So, you know, a good poet is a very clever individual who has a hell of a lot in terms of understanding the cultural context in which they're writing.
I love that. So let's just back up a little bit. So Vikings in popular culture are one thing, TV shows, and I can tell by the sound of voice that we're not going to criticise. I don't think we should criticise TV because it's entertainment and stuff.
Oh, I love it. Noggin the Nog was my entry into the Viking world, to be honest. So yeah, no, I'm all up for TV.
Noggin the Nog, Nog Bad the Bad.
Nog Bad the Bad, yeah, Nuka, yeah.
Wonderful.
Graculus, always a good one. He's the, yeah.
Is he talking crow? Is he the crow?
Yeah, he's the birdie thing. Oh gosh, this is terrible.
It's a long time ago.
Yeah.
So what do we mean by Vikings from a historical perspective?
Well, there's an Old Norse, so this language that the Vikings spoke, version of the word Vikingur, which is essentially someone who sort of goes off on a raid, a pirate. And there's another Norse word, which is the act itself. So you go on a Viking, you go on a raid. And the Anglo-Saxons in like roughly what is now England had their own Old English version of that word, wiching, which again basically means pirate. So that's the original, very specific context. And so if we're talking about the Viking Age, in its strictest sense, we're talking about the age in which people raided. And so we're talking about the end of the 8th century, things like, the raid on Lindisfarne, fiery dragons were seen in the air and sheets of lightning, and then the heathen men attacked God's church on Lindisfarne, and there's plundering and slaughter. So that is quite useful. But the problem is that if we're talking about Vikings, well, not everyone living in the sort of early medieval Scandinavian world, or sort of the Nordic diaspora as they start to spread out beyond Scandinavia, is a Viking. Of course they're not. And even people who did go on raids, they're not Vikings in that very strict sense all the time. So it's not a bad thing that we have to expand that definition. Now, the point where Viking sort of gets reintroduced and becomes this kind of catch-all word for the whole of the Norse world in this period is essentially the 19th century. The Victorians are Viking mad. So again, we have to temper that a little bit. We can't just shove everything in that box because, if we think of Vikings, we think of the raiding and the slaughter and the pillaging, and all those things are true, but that sort of reduces a very complex culture to something that's really quite, well, talking of Nog in the Nog, quite cartoonish and quite oversimplified. And so we've got to strike that balance. And really, it's much more exciting and much more interesting once we start to open up that world. We started with poetry, we started with mythology, that's all there, but that again is pushing us beyond that strict sense of the word.
Is there an academic term that's used apart from the Viking Age? I mean, you talk about the early medieval migration era. Is the migration era related?
Migration era is sort of the period that's leading up to the Viking Age, where everyone's sort of moving around the place after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, sort of basically speaking. And that very much feeds into what happens in the Viking Age. So it's really important not to divorce those two. But academics like to argue over everything, right? That's kind of the point, isn't it?
Well, that's the point. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I mean, Norse is a useful word if you're talking about the cultural sphere, talking about the things that come out of the Viking Age. That's pretty useful. And it's, of course, the word we use for the language. There's an Old Norse or a Viking Age word, Norrøn, or, Norsk, all those sorts of words that they were using at that time. There was an awareness that they had a common cultural sphere. They spoke in a common tongue. They also say the Dunske tunge, so the sort of Danish language. So that's a good way of sort of showing that there's this, you often now hear that term diaspora used because they spread out really far culturally, but they still very much are connected back to those heartlands and to those sort of historical origins. So Norse is useful, but you wouldn't say Norse age. Yeah, you can say early medieval Scandinavia, but it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, does it?
No, it doesn't. It's not very poetic. It's not a kenning in any way, shape or form, is it?
Yeah, exactly. I think plenty of academics these days are kind of coming to the somewhat reluctant conclusion that no one's come up with anything better than Viking Age. And Vikings are quite, well, as you say, they're there in TV shows because they're sexy, they're bloodthirsty, they're dramatic, they're colourful,
Well, they're heroic and adventuring in some ways. And I wonder whether a synonym for to go Viking is to go raiding. And in some ways, you could compare it to going adventuring.
Yeah.
You could almost liken them to adventurers,
Yeah, I think so. And exactly that. And I think that's a more useful way of thinking about it. And I'm going to use a very unexciting word, which is sort of that sense of mobility. But actually, raiding is one variation of that, sure. But they move on from raiding, give or take. There's colonizing, there's exploring, there's settlement, there's sort of attacking in ways that are more sustained than raiding as well. But, this takes them all the way to the edge of the North American continent. It takes them up into the far Arctic. It takes them over to the Eurasian steppes, what's now Russia and Ukraine and all that region, going all the way down the waterways, the Volga, to Baghdad, to Byzantium, so there are raiding in all those places. There's violence, absolutely. And it's not, again, I don't think it's wise to try and rehabilitate this period as kind of like a cuddly soft, because it's not. And again, we started off with poetry and, the people who produce kennings, the best poets, they're often the most violent as well. So it's complex, but adventuring, traveling, exploring, it's that sense of movement that's really important.
It certainly seems like part of their culture, or for a proportion of the population, the culture of going off as far as you can in a direction and seeing what you find was a big thing, and not worrying about asking permission, not worrying about going there and fighting if you want to.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because there's definitely, I mean, so there's one of the sagas, so again, written down in the 13th century in Iceland predominantly, but looking back with a lot of sort of oral traditions heading back through the centuries into the Viking Age. There's one where they're talking about seeing the edge of the North American continent for the first time. And in one of the stories, the person, I think his name is Bjarni, who sights it, doesn't want to land there. And he's criticised for that. That's not a good thing. But then on the other hand, we have to think, well, what are the sort of people who can, they have the resources to have a ship, have something that's ocean going rather than just a rowing boat that you can hop around the coast in, for example, and plenty of people wouldn't have even had those. How long does it take to make a sail, for example? And what sort of resources do you need, both in terms of woman power, because it is very much a female occupation, that a very, very important one, but also just you've got to have that many goats and sheep, right? How far up the pecking order do you need to be that even if you're not the one that owns that boat, you are invited onto the ship? If you're raiding, well, you've got to have the weapons, you've got to have the resources to get over there. So again, you've got to think, well, okay, for a lot of people, mostly what they're doing is they're farming, they're fishing, they're hunting, they're trying to just get by. But that's part of the reason I wanted to look at those different sorts of embers of the hands in this book, because it's this sense of that is important as well. But it's not only that it's important in a sort of slightly dry, worthy way, it's the sort of everyday normality of the human experience is also fascinating and full of drama and life and emotions and, joy and sorrow and all sorts of things that we tend to only see from the historical record because it's either the people at the top of the pile who are being written about in the chronicles and the annals and the sagas, or when they're found in the burial record, well, they're the ones who've got the bling. So once again, it's a more sort of exciting story. Well, actually, let's find the excitement in that everyday sort of life.
I think that's really interesting because I studied the later medieval period quite a lot. And one of the things I'm constantly aware of is that most of us would have been farmers, peasants.
Yeah.
And a tiny proportion lived in the towns and an even tinier proportion were nobility.
Yeah.
And so, if you were to cast yourself back, there's a pretty certain chance that most of us would have been peasant farmers.
Yeah. And that's if you're lucky. That's if you're not enslaved, right? And that's a whole other kettle of fish. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Now, how do we know these things about the Vikings in particular? And it seems like a lot of them were, you could almost call them Renaissance people in that they're poets and fighters at the same time. Now, obviously, the Renaissance comes an awful lot later, so maybe we should describe people in the Renaissance as a bit Viking-like. But
I think they'd like that. The Vikings would approve of that.
Maybe the idea of being a fighting poet is quite a nice description. But how do we know about them?
So there's all sorts of different ways. And I think the most useful thing you can often do when you're trying to get into that very different world, and it's an alien world and it always will be in so many ways, but it's to look at all the different facets that different sorts of evidence can give us. So textual sources are really important, and there's all sorts of different ways that those can happen. So if you're looking at the period itself, in the Viking Age, people who were living there weren't literate in the way that we think of, medieval monks in their scriptoria writing manuscripts. So we don't have that sort of textual evidence from within the Norse world, but we do have runes. And we can talk a little bit more about runes in a bit, because runes are just an incredible way of getting to see a little bit of everyday people's lives, because so many people use them. There are then the written texts that I described, the kind of scriptoria monks, but if they're contemporary with the Viking Age itself, they're not going to be Vikings, as we might think of. Anyone who can't see, I'm kind of doing the air quotes, right? But, members of that culture. And so that means that they're going to have very different reasons for writing about the Vikings. And particularly if you're talking about raids by pagans on undefended, fabulously wealthy coastal monasteries around northwestern Europe, it's not going to be a good tale, They're not getting a good rap from that, right? So
I have this really weird vision of the first Vikings landing and going, are you telling me there's no defences here?
What? Yes.
Yeah, are you sure this isn't some kind of weird trap? And there's gold and stuff, and these guys are all pacifists.
Yes.
Yeah. And we're not, and we can just take this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so there is actually, talking of these textual records, so the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, there's a record in it's sort of the late 780s, so just before sort of the big raids that we know by name up the coast. But it says there's 3 ships of the Northmen that landed on the Isle of Portland, so way, way, way south coast of England. And the Reeve, the King's Reeve, Anglo-Saxon, came up to basically see what they were doing, and he wanted to take them up to see the king, and they didn't want to do that, and so they killed the Reeve. And so you're not sure if they're there as raiders or exactly as you say, they've just sort of landed and said, oh, well, I don't really want to pay taxes, thank you very much, but I'm sure there's stuff we can take from it. So yeah, you're never quite sure of that context. But of course, we have to remember as well that they don't appear out of nowhere in this, oh my goodness, who are these? Sure, it says in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, never before has such a terror appeared. But that's in a very specific context. And that doesn't mean never before has a Scandinavian appeared on these shores. Not at all. There's a reason they know that these monasteries are undefended and wealthy. So we do have those sorts of types of evidence, but then we also have material evidence, so archaeological evidence. That might be something like a grave, but that might also be something like, well, I mentioned runes because they sort of fall in that hazy boundary land between textual sources and material sources. We have evidence of small children. We have a very small amount of evidence for enslaved people, and those come from material evidence. And then we have another sort of material evidence that's really only started to emerge in the past few decades and is still emerging. So it's a really exciting period to be looking at in this context, because we have the scientific data and scientific techniques that are really getting more and more sophisticated. And so DNA, for example, is sort of only now being able to tell us about, for example, the relationships between different people that have been found from the Viking Age in very different contexts. They recently brought together 2 men for a big Viking Age exhibition at the National Museum in Copenhagen. And one of them had been very brutally murdered and found in a mass grave in St. John's College in Oxford. And the other one, very similar period, had been found on the island of Fyn in Denmark. And then they did this big DNA study and they found that actually they were second-degree relatives. So nephew and uncle, or grandfather and grandchild, or sort of half-brothers or something like that. And so suddenly you're starting to draw lines across the world, but through very modern techniques that were never available to us before. So it's an exciting time. It's really cool.
So tell us a little bit more about runes, because I'm sort of aware of runes in lots of different ways, but these are very specific, aren't they?
Oh yeah, love a good rune. Yeah. So runes are, it's that spiky alphabet you see a lot. Still, people have them often as tattoos. If anyone's visited Orkney and flown into the airport at Kirkwall, there's runes spelling out Kirkwall above the airport, so all sorts of places. And runes aren't specific to the Viking Age, and they're not specific to Scandinavian culture. They seem to have come out of the sort of cultural ferment that is contact between Northern Europe and the Roman Empire. That seems to be because there's sort of connections. If you look at the way that the letters are written, they're often quite similar.
So Roman numerals.
Yeah, sort of Latin, Latin script. Yeah, so
that's fascinating.
It really is, isn't it? So when they first start being used, and our earliest ones where we can actually see what's been written are from way before the Viking Age. They're from sort of the 2nd century CE. And there's one that I talk about in the book really early on. I'm fascinated, and it's an inscription on a comb. And it says Harja, which might mean comb. It might be someone's personal name. It might refer to something in a military context. But it's found in a bog in Denmark, and it's part of sort of war booty that's been sacrificed to the bog. And there's all sorts of Roman artifacts in there too. There's an amazing Roman war helmet, with a griffin on it, and there's board games that again seem to have been picked up from the Roman Empire. So, you mentioned the migration age earlier, and that's very important for looking at how many things that we think of as being very quintessentially Viking Age actually come from those centuries leading up to it. it starts off as a sort of elite, quite secret, possibly way of writing things down. But by the time you get to the tail end of the Viking Age and what we might think of as post-Viking Age, sort of 1200, 1300, runes are basically being used by all sorts of people for all sorts of purposes. They're often drunk when they're writing them. There's a wonderful cache of runes written on little, mostly fragments of wood, occasionally bits of bone, bits of metal, that archaeologists found in the 1950s in Bergen in Norway. If anyone's been to Bergen or seen pictures, you see those beautiful waterside, sort of pointy roofed, very colourful buildings in this place called Bryggen, which is the dock where everyone puts their ships, basically. And there was a big fire. And when the archaeologists were then looking afterwards, they found it's like over 700 of these little runic inscriptions. And they're basically just like bits of post-it notes. These aren't the kind of runes that we might think of that are on big memorial inscriptions on stones, that everyone's meant to see. One of my favourites, it was probably found in the location of what was a tavern. And one side just says, Gyda says, go home. And it's probably someone who's just been in the pub too long. Someone at home is waiting, has got really pissed off. Then there's others that are incredibly rude, lots of really juicy language that, I don't know, I don't want to shock your listeners, but there's some, it's things like
scatological and sexual.
Exactly, scatological and sexual. People can see it all in the book. I had to do the audiobook. I got to chapter 3 when all this foul language appears. I said, my dad might be listening to this. I can't use those. But yeah, so there's a lot of that. All human life is there.
Aren't the runes in Byzantium and places?
Oh yeah, they're all over the place. Byzantium, there's, again, one of my favourites. So in Hagia Sophia, which is now the mosque, it was the Christian basilica back in the Viking Age. And there are a lot of Vikings in Byzantium. They call it essentially Miklagarður, which means the big city, the equivalent of the Big Apple. And they go there to make their fortunes. They're often there as members of the emperor's personal bodyguard, including some quite famous figures who people might have heard of, like Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, gets killed, Battle of Stamford Bridge, 1066, that sort of thing. So when they're there, if they're not Christian, then often they find themselves having to become Christian quite quickly. And in Hagia Sophia, the second floor, if anyone's been there, there's the lovely sort of marble stone looking down over where the ceremonies would have taken place. There's just graffiti everywhere. And it's not just runic. It's just everyone who's basically been there is having to sit through these long masses, possibly doesn't understand what's being said. They might not have converted yet. And it's just these different texts, these different scripts just scurrying over the stone. And there's one that's Norse runes, and it says, essentially, Halfdan was here. And I just love it. And then a little further along, they found, I think it's the graffitied outline of 5 Viking ships, and one of them's got this like dragon head with pointy ears and little goatee beard. And you just imagine these very bored Norse travellers, visitors coming to Byzantium and suddenly having to sit through these very long masses and thinking, well, I've got a knife. Let's see how I can entertain myself.
Like schoolboys.
Totally that, yeah.
School children back in the day when you had pen knives.
Yeah, again, we mentioned Orkney, Kirkwall. One of the most amazing places if you're looking for runic graffiti is Maeshowe. And it's a chambered cairn. It's 5,000 years old. It's that one that, the midwinter light when the sun rises comes straight through. Vikings absolutely covered it in graffiti. Again, some really rude graffiti as well. And one of the people who was in there carving seems to have been the Jarl, the ruler of Orkney at the time. So everyone was
leaving their mark.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things you talked about in your book is hostage stone. What's a hostage stone? I mean, I could probably guess, but I'd probably be horribly wrong.
Oh, well, I sort of, part of me wants to ask you to guess, and part of me thinks, it's so cool. Let's just talk about it. So,
okay.
So I'm very familiar with the island of Bute in Scotland, the Isle of Bute. It's absolutely glorious. And growing up, my dad was born there, so I used to spend an awful lot of time. I still do, an awful lot of time there. This tiny little island just off Bute, which is uninhabited now. I think they used to send the drunks out there to dry off in the 19th century. But if we go back to at least the sort of early medieval period, the kind of dawn of the Viking Age, there was this big monastery there. And archaeologists have found some incredible evidence from this monastery, not least lots of pieces of slate and other stone that are carved with people practicing their writing, people practicing their illustrations, all fairly sort of religious in their overtones, except this incredible piece of slate. It's a piece of broken off slate, and this is the hostage stone. And someone has scratched into it a picture. And this picture is of a very punk-haired, wild-bearded, very tall, I want to say warrior, because he looks like he's wearing chainmail. And he's got a couple of companions who've sort of been broken off the stone, but you can see bits and pieces of them, and a ship. And this is a bit like the one in Hagia Sophia on the walls. It's a long ship. It's a Viking ship. But you go from this punk-haired warrior and you follow, and he's got someone on the end of a piece of rope. And it's a human. And they've got their little bound hands. And it looks very much like a monk, sort of a very little monk, maybe a novice, maybe a teenager, very young person. And they are being led to the ship. And they have sort of chained to them what looks like a handbag. It's probably a reliquary. So, one of these things that they kept little bits and pieces of saints in. And that's also being taken to the ship. And from the Vikings' point of view, he's either, they call him a hostage, in the sense of it's called a hostage stone, but you could also call it an enslavement stone, because we don't know what happened to this person. Sometimes annals tell us, particularly from Ireland, that they were taken as hostage and then given back to their communities if people paid the ransom. Other times they would just be taken off and sold into enslavement, and that would be the last that anyone would ever hear of them. And what's really interesting is the fact that he's carrying this reliquary as well, because from the point of view of the Viking raiders, that reliquary was made of precious metal, and it was every bit as important to them in terms of what's often called portable wealth. And it's crazy, but you often find where it turns up, these sort of fragments of reliquaries or whole reliquaries in a Norwegian context, so on the other side of the North Sea, when they've been removed from the British Isles and Ireland, you find them in the graves of females. And so what it looks like is the raiders were taking them back to their girlfriends or their wives, or people they hoped would become their girlfriends or their wives. And it's part of the answer, it seems, to the question of why were they raiding? What were they doing? Why did the Viking Age happen? And all sorts of reasons have been suggested in the past, and some of those are probably true and some of those are probably not. But one that sort of is increasingly popular is the idea that essentially they were looking for, it was sort of the people sort of one tier down from the top dogs back in Norwegian, in this case, society. And they were looking for ways to bolster their reputation, bolster their status, bolster their wealth. So someone would then be happy to settle down with them. They'd have the resources to build a farmstead, maybe have some descendants. And I mean, one of these reliquaries that was found, they're not quite sure, but certainly it ended up in Scandinavia, put it that way. It's got the name of a woman. She's carved her name in runes in the bottom. I think it's Ranveig.
Mm.
Yeah, so it's like, this is mine. This is a beautiful thing.
They were going off raiding, bringing stuff back, and not necessarily selling it.
No.
But sometimes, some things they were giving to their significant other.
Yeah.
That's another way of putting it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that dissimilar to today with people with posh watches or with nice frocks or jewellery.
That's it.
We're not raiding for it.
Well, hopefully not. Yeah, I don't. No, exactly. It's a nice bit of bling. It's a nice present. One of my absolutely favourite places that what looks like either a piece of a reliquary or possibly part of a decorated metal cover from sort of a Christian gospel book, one of my favourite places that such an item ends up is in the grave of a mother and a child. And it looks like they probably didn't survive childbirth. And it's on Orkney. It's on the island of Rousey in Orkney. And it's from a bit later. It's kind of, I think it's the second half of the 10th century off the top of my head, but I could be wrong. But so it's not the raiding period itself, but it's a little piece of sort of bronze metal, and it's either a pouncing wolf or a dog or a lion or something with its jaws open. And it's been repurposed as a brooch. Someone's turned it into a piece of jewellery. And it's been sort of essentially passed, it looks like, it's been passed down the generations as an heirloom. And I think there's, not to sort of take away from the fact that the circumstances under which it sort of passed from religious artefact to piece of jewellery may well have been quite horrific. So I don't want to take away from that. But it is a very moving burial. And it's so full of amazing artefacts, this burial of the mother and her child.
These things tell us so much of a story, don't they? Because that piece of repurposed holy book, which appears several hundred years later, arguably, tells you a little bit, and we can hypothesize about how it got there and why. And it's obviously travelled through time and been preserved. And it's respected enough to be buried with somebody. As a sort of gift to them to the afterlife, or just as a way of saying goodbye. And so, these things they tell us about the people behind the things. I had a quick question. So when Vikings stole stuff, or raided, or grabbed it, or however you want to phrase it, when they took stuff that wasn't theirs before, I mean, some of it they obviously kept, but did they go and sell it? Did they sell people? And to who did they sell these people? And did they have them on the ship and take them on long journeys and then sell them far away?
So there are some within sort of Northwest Europe to start with. There are some places that, we know today, places like Dublin, for example, and Bristol, I think as well, but certainly Dublin, that were major trading ports, international ones, which also meant they were major slavers' ports, and we know it's interesting that the few examples we have of metal shackles, because most of the time you'd probably just use rope, right? But the metal shackles tend to come from these ports. Places also like Birka, which is this very important international trading hub in Sweden. It's an island. So we know that they're being traded. We know that they're probably being traded really quite far. So down to, Baghdad, Byzantium, potentially.
So people are being tied up in boats.
And
taken on long sea journeys to goodness knows where, and then being landed and sold. They sold for cash, or swapped for gold, or what do we know?
Well, so silver is sort of the really valuable thing in this period, and it's not just enslaved people that are being sold. It's portable goods and wealth and all sorts of things. And there are Arabic sources that give lists of the sort of goods that are being traded up and down the waterways of Eurasia. But certainly slaves are amongst them. And it is true that you find an awful lot of silver dirhams coming in various sort of in waves during the Viking Age from the Islamic world up into sort of the Scandinavian world and around.
Oh, right. So we've got Islamic coinage that's
lots.
all the way up in the
lots
in Scandinavia. Okay.
More, I think, than we often sort of realise. Those connections were very, very strong. But there are other ways. So, for example, the settlement of Iceland, which happens in 871 plus or minus 2. I'm going to look that up. But the interesting thing there is that in the sagas that are written later, you have a sense of a very prominent element of these kind of first settlers that actually come from the British Isles, and lots of them are enslaved people. And so the very first permanent settlers to Iceland come with their slaves. In fact, there's a slave revolt. The Westman Islands, Vestmannaeyjar, which are still what they're called today, are named for the fact that Irish people end up sort of fleeing there when a revolt goes wrong against the people or at least their masters at that point. And what's really interesting is there seems to be a higher proportion of those first generations of settlers, female settlers who come from the British Isles. And you can tell that, again, this is, talking about different sort of evidence. The DNA evidence, the mitochondrial DNA evidence of modern Icelandic women, more of that has more in common with DNA kind of makeup of the British Isles. And more of the male, sort of what's on the Y chromosome, the version of that, has more in common with the version of that is sort of dominant in Norway. And it's not true that means that it's that old myth of basically a load of Norwegians swing past the British Isles, enslave a load of women and take them up to Iceland. But There is probably some element of truth in that. We're not saying that all the women who end up from the British Isles going to Iceland are enslaved, but sure as hell a good proportion of them are going to be, and also some of the men. So they're not all being sold on to kind of far northern reaches. But then there's other things that are ransomed as well. So there's an amazing book. It's a sort of gospel book, and it's gold and it's shining and it's the most beautiful. You can see why the Vikings wanted it. They're like, this is good bling. But the reason they've taken it, other than the cover, which is metal, and I think they probably kept, they've taken it to ransom that back as well. So they would ransom people back from prominent communities if they could be paid. Abbots, for example, Irish abbots get ransomed. But so do artefacts. And so a sort of prominent Anglo-Saxon person has actually written on this manuscript. They've said, I ransomed this back. I brought this back from the Vikings. I paid them gold and I have this back. So it's this problematic situation where often humans are being treated as chattel, and it's the same sort of processes going on. Having said that, this is not a purely Viking phenomenon at all. When Alfred the Great, as he's later known, but King Alfred of Wessex in Anglo-Saxon England, he makes peace with Guthrum, who's the leader of the Viking army and sort of the great heathen army that appears in England in 865. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms kind of topple quite quickly, and then King Alfred is, at least according to his own propaganda, but there is going to be some truth in this, he's left sort of the last one standing. So they make peace, and that's how what we know as the Danelaw then comes about, where there's kind of the northern and eastern part of England is being ruled by Scandinavians, essentially. But in the peace treaty, one of the things they say is, we won't harbour each other's runaway slaves.
That's interesting. Oh, that's a detail I didn't know. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not just the Vikings who've got slaves. Mm-hmm. And certainly I read somewhere that people try and calculate what proportion of the population of England was enslaved at the time of Domesday Book, and it's like something like 10%. Mm-hmm. And they're not all of Scandinavian descent at all. So this is something that is widespread, and everyone seems to have their own versions of what is moral when it comes to enslaving other people, So for some people it's, well, as long as they're not Christian.
Yeah, it's a very difficult area of history, because obviously there's the whole concept of modern African slavery, sort of 19th century, which still permeates modern cultures in the West. But you've also, when people sort of say, white people, etc., and then know that slavery has been a factor of civilizations for millennia.
Yeah, it's a very ugly side of humanity.
Tragic, it's awful.
Yeah.
But we don't want to gloss over it. The Vikings had slaves, and so did the Anglo-Saxons.
Yeah. And the Franks and everyone else.
Pretty much everybody did.
Yeah.
In some way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, well, let's lighten the conversation to
yes.
what did Vikings wear?
Ooh.
We have this Hollywood idea about horned helmets, which I think has been widely debunked. And in fact, I don't think there are many Viking helmets in existence.
They're really not.
Which is a bit odd.
Yeah, exactly. So, I get into trouble because if I'm like signing my book or something, my signature is so awful that I have to put a little cartoon Viking in it, and it always has horned helmets. And I once had someone come back with their child who had looked inside to see what I'd done and was actually coming back to tell me off. But no, exactly. So it's not common. There are other ways, how do you spot a Viking? Say if you're in some part of England in the period of, the Danelaws we're talking about, how can you tell that someone is of Scandinavian heritage? Well, often maybe you can't. But there are certain things. I mean, hair care, that's a big one. So as far as the Vikings were concerned, hair was really important, and so was bathing. And so one of the most frequent items you find in graves, from the top to the bottoms of the pile, are combs. People have their personal combs. There's a wonderful, it's not the comb, but it's the comb case from Lincoln in, the Viking Age. And it has runes carved on it. It says, Thordafast, someone's name, made a good comb. So someone is really proud of their skills. And quite rightly too, because if the comb gives us a sense of anything because of the comb case, it's a beautiful thing. So often the Anglo-Saxons really don't like this. They're really pissed off about this because essentially the Scandinavians are making them look bad. And so there's one account by Alfred of Ancient, and so he's Anglo-Saxon. He's writing in around, 1000 AD. He's writing to someone he calls Brother Edward. Maybe his real brother, maybe a religious brother. And he says, you do something wrong, Brother Edward, you're aping the styles of the Vikings with bare neck and shaggy fringe, essentially. It's this idea of kind of, short at the back, long at the front. And they didn't give life to you. And why are you dressing like this? You're basically a fashion victim. And what I love, he then goes on, he's clearly disapproving about very many things, but he says, oh, and by the way, tell the country women living near you to stop eating and drinking on the loo, because it's absolutely disgusting. But the most important thing is stop doing that thing with your hair. So, and then there's another account, and this comes, a couple of centuries later. And so it's a writer in England looking back. And he says, these Scandinavian settlers were absolutely awful because they looked so good and they changed their socks and they were so sexy and they bathed every week. And so all the Anglo-Saxon women wanted to run off with them. You're like, well, you don't say, So, and in fact, in sort of all Scandinavian languages still today, there's a version of the Old Norse word for Saturday, which is laugardagur, which is like bath day, washing day, the sense that, that's what you do on a Saturday. And
fantastic. Yeah. So it's a very big part of the culture.
Yeah, exactly.
So you mentioned board games, for example, and what about entertainment, board games, music? What about the sort of Viking evening?
Well, there is lots, at least for part of the year, there is an awful lot of evening. It's really interesting. I think that's probably part of why there is such a rich play culture in the Viking world, because there are lots of dark winter nights. You can't
long nights. There's so much you can do during the daylight, but you're not going to sleep for 15 hours a night, are you?
Exactly. And we started by talking about poetry and, by extension, the storytelling culture, and that was a very, very strong part of it. But again, what's interesting there is obviously most of what we know about that is what is transmitted through oral tradition down the generations until it gets written down. But the problem there is we don't know what we can trust and what we can't trust. We can definitely trust some of it, but definitely not all of it.
Yes.
But then occasionally you find these tiny little bits. So from a very ordinary sort of medium-sized farm in Norse Greenland, and Greenland is one of my absolute favourite parts of the Norse or the Viking Age world, and it's a place where I've done quite a lot of research. It's not an easy place to move around in. There are no roads. You can't just hire a car and go from sort of Ilulissat to Nuuk or something. So you have to find ways of moving around that very much mimic the sort of ways that the Vikings would have moved around these landscapes. But on this farm, there is, it's runes, and it just seems to be part of, I would say, a poem. There's one, it's part of a poem, and it's not the best poem, but it's still a poem. There's another example also from a farm in North Greenland, which seems to be wordplay. It's that idea of the same sounding words being used to construct these sort of slightly joke sentences. And from another North Greenlandic farm, there's the bridge of what seems to be essentially a fiddle, a stringed instrument of some sort. And so you get this sense of, people around the winter fire, or from up in the hills, and there's sort of sheilings, places where you'd have taken the animals over the summer. And again, so we think, okay, long, light evenings, sure, but also a lot of downtime where you're basically just watching your sheep and your goats, and there's only so much spinning you can do. And again, so you find things like sheep knuckles. So, that sense of, that game that the Romans knew so well, what's it called? Astralgi, where you're playing with sheep knuckles. And again, that seems to be because they're found all together. They're probably in a leather bag. The leather's now rotted away, and you just get the knuckles remaining. And then you get board games, and this amazing board game, very sort of stereotypically Viking Age, called Hnefatafel, which is like fist table. And it's this grid, and you have the king piece in the middle, and then what they call sort of the maids defending him around the outside, and he's got to try and get to the edge of the board without, the pieces of the other team capturing him, essentially. You have very, very beautiful examples of such board games from the sort of upper echelons of society. But my favourite are the ones where, they're just some scratches, and you can see there's a slight depression in the middle on the stone where the king piece would have sat, and you get some incredible gaming pieces that, found in graves where it's like, beautiful coloured glass and these blobby little figures, or men with beards made out of walrus ivory and whalebone, but often with the kind of slightly crappy boards that are half worn away by the centuries and by the elements. You're not going to actually have the pieces surviving because they'd have just used whatever they had. Okay, we use these stones, that's fine. Well, that's not going to show up in the record. But just that echo of board games played in all sorts of circumstances, on ships as well.
Yeah, it conjures up this sort of quite wonderful, cozy hall type of experience. Some people are playing these board games. There's somebody telling a tale, a poem or something out loud, people sitting around listening. Other people are drinking, presumably, or chatting away or playing word games.
Yeah.
And then later on that year, they're going raiding. They're going to put on the kit and go raiding.
Exactly that.
The thing with helmets that interests me is because the culture was very much about quickness and raiding, especially to begin with, a helmet is something more for stand-up combat. And it's a pain to carry around, quite frankly. And so is armour. And if you're not expecting, or you're not intending to do a stand-up fight, you're going in there, you're armed because there might be a little bit of resistance, but not much. You want to raid, get in, grab stuff and leave quickly.
Yes.
Armour sort of holds you back. It slows you down.
Exactly.
It's annoying to wear, gets in the way, saves your life if you're in a battle. But they're not expecting to have battles. They're expecting to hit and run. They're like special forces in a way. They go in there, do the job and get out again. So
Exactly. No, I totally agree. And certainly with the early raiding phase, you're going up against unarmed people for the most point. You're not in as much danger. You would possibly be in more danger if you've got a really heavy boat. These quite small boats relative, and you filled it full of metal.
Yes.
It's not necessary,
Very good.
Later on, when you get this kind of, the Great Heathen Army, for example, appearing in 9th century Britain, yes, you're going to have more armour there. But again, for most people, that might look like stuff that wouldn't necessarily survive in the archaeological records. So sort of hardened leather caps, for example. You have a lot of people who would not have been, or their lives would not have been valuable enough and their means not great enough to afford the sort of armour that might actually save their lives.
Yes. I often think in situations like that, if you don't have armour, you probably want to wear what you've got or tie leather straps around your head just to give you a moment of
exactly
expedient equipment that is not going to be recognised in the record as anything to do with the battle anyway.
That's it. And you have to sort of remember how much of that record is gone. So when things that are sort of organic material, like the runic inscriptions on the little pieces of wood, when they survive, and that's also part of the reason I love North Greenland so much, because historically, because of the permafrost particularly, a lot more by way of organic material survives. There's a bit in the book where I've talked to some incredible glacial archaeologists working in Norway, and it's terrible. The reason they are working now is because the glaciers are melting and things are coming out of the glaciers, and so it's very much a race against time. But again, the volume of organic material that usually would just be completely vanished from the record is extraordinary and tells us a lot about the sorts of parts of society, again, that would be more likely to be represented in that organic material. So women, for example, and you think of textile manufacture, most of that isn't going to survive. Maybe the loom weights, if they're made from sort of stones or clay, maybe that survives. But so much of the richness of the culture of the Viking world is down to the sort of people who are peripheral in the official records, in the textual records. And it's people like women, young people, old people, poor people.
Ordinary people.
Ordinary people.
Who were living their lives that are ordinary at the time.
Exactly.
I think it's a wonderful place to finish. So your book is called Embers of the Hands. Is it out now? Is it available?
It is, available in all good bookshops and online purveyors. So Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Ages. It's quite blingy and golden on the front. I rather like
Sounds very appropriate. Is there any other place if people want to follow your work or follow you in social media? Is there anything?
Well, social media not, because I sort of made the decision that this was not going to end well for me. I get far too anxious to be on social media. But I try to update my website, but it's just eleanorbarraclough.com. And there you can sort of click through to most of my stuff. Actually, I updated it a couple of weeks ago and I realised I hadn't updated it before then since last December. So I felt absolutely terrible.
The curse of obligation of social media.
Exactly. Well, that's hence why I'm not on social media.
Yeah, you feel you need to keep creating stuff for people you don't know very well. Wonderful. Thank you so much for talking to us. I really appreciated it.
Such a pleasure.